All right, welcome back to the deep dive. For those of you who love to think deeply about, well, pretty much everything, today we're tackling a concept that's, how should I put it? It's kind of a big one.
Definitely a big one. We're diving into faith, a
Mhm.
concept that, while often linked with religion, has fascinated philosophers for, well, centuries, really.
And it's not just about believing in a higher power or anything like that. It's about the very nature of belief itself, how we form it, how it shapes us.
Exactly. The whole idea of what it means to have faith, how it relates to reason, to knowledge, to the choices we make in life. It's a rich, complex topic. And lucky for us, we have a really solid guide for this deep dive, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on faith. It's basically like our philosophical roadmap for this episode.
Yeah, it's super thorough. And our mission, if you will, is to kind of unpack all of that for you. So those of you with, that philosophical mindset that I know so many of our listeners have, you can really appreciate all the nuances of how faith is, well, how it's understood in all these different philosophical discussions.
And we're going to try to do that in a way that's clear and engaging without getting too bogged down in jargon.
Yeah,
Make it accessible for everyone.
exactly. Okay, so let's jump right in. One of the first things that might surprise you when you start exploring the philosophy of faith is that there isn't actually a universally agreed upon, definition of faith.
It sounds simple, right? Like you have faith in something. But when you really start to pick it apart, it becomes a lot more complicated.
It's true. Like in everyday language, we talk about having faith in a friend, faith in a scientific theory, or even faith that, like, the bus will be on time.
Exactly. Those everyday examples, they sort of point to this idea of reliance, right? A sense of expectation.
Yeah.
You're depending on something, whether it's a person or a concept or, well, public transportation.
But then you get into these philosophical discussions about faith, and especially when you talk about religious faith, which, let's be honest, is usually what people think of first. Things get way more complicated. Like, is faith primarily a feeling, a belief? Than action, or maybe like a weird combo of all of those things.
Yeah, philosophers have been debating the ontology of faith, like forever. Is it a psychological state? If so, is it primarily cognitive, emotional? And how does it relate to your actions and your behavior in the world?
So many questions. And speaking of religious faith, I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry does focus mainly on that, right? Particularly what they call theistic faith, basically faith in God, believing that God exists, and committing to a whole theistic worldview.
Right. Because, focusing on that lets us get into some of the really core philosophical arguments about faith in general. But it's important to remember that what we learn by examining theistic faith, it might actually shed light on other types of faith as well, like faith in, I don't know, humanity's progress or something. But we'll come back to that
We
later.
will. Okay. So even defining faith is like a philosophical puzzle in itself. But when you look at all the different attempts to define it, they often center around certain, key components. Like, what are the fundamental aspects that pop up again and again?
Yeah, you can think of it like this. Philosophers have identified four main components that often show up in their analysis of faith. You've got the cognitive component, which is all about like your beliefs and understanding. Then you've got the affective component, which is about feelings and emotions. And then there's the evaluative component, which has to do with how you value things, what you prioritize. And finally, there's the practical component, the actions and commitments that flow from your faith.
Okay, that makes sense. So each of these different models of faith might emphasize one or more of these components and how they relate to each other, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting. You have all these different ways of understanding something that on the surface seems pretty straightforward.
Right. Okay, so let's dive into those different models, starting with, well, maybe one of the more intuitive ones. The idea of faith as primarily an affective experience. Like, some people would argue that faith at its core is really just a feeling, a deep sense of assurance or trust, or maybe even just like a sense of peace about existence.
Right. And some philosophers have suggested that Wittgenstein, for example, might have viewed faith almost as like a fundamental emotional attitude toward life, this deep underlying sense of security. And if that sense of security were to collapse, it would be, well, a pretty profound psychological experience.
That makes sense. It's like you're just fundamentally secure in your, I don't know, your place in the universe or something. But when it comes to theistic faith, it does feel like simply having that general feeling isn't really enough, right?
You're right. I mean, theistic faith, to be faith in something, needs an object. It's not just a free-floating sense of trust. It's specifically directed toward God. So while having an effective component is probably part of the experience for many people of faith, if you only focus on the emotions, you're missing a key piece of the puzzle.
Right. It's not just about feeling good. It's about feeling good about something specific.
Right. Exactly. So you need that cognitive element, some kind of belief or understanding to really grasp what theistic faith is about. It's not just feeling, it's also thinking.
So that brings us to a pretty interesting idea. Faith as a form of knowledge, which on the surface might seem a little counterintuitive, because a lot of times faith is associated with uncertainty, with taking a leap into the unknown. So how can something like faith be considered a type of knowing?
That's a great question. And it's where we get into some fascinating philosophical territory. See, some models propose that faith actually is a kind of knowledge. And often they're talking about propositional knowledge, which means knowing that certain things are true, like specific religious truths. Alvin Plantinga, who draws a lot from the Reformed theological tradition, he's been a really big proponent of this view.
Ah, Plantinga. Yeah, his name comes up a lot in these kinds of discussions. And what about his idea of what's it called, Reformed epistemology?
So, Reformed epistemology basically argues that belief in God can be justified even if it's not based on, like, strict logical arguments or empirical evidence that's derived from other beliefs. In Plantinga's view, these theistic beliefs can be basic, meaning they're directly evident in your experience. You don't arrive at them through some kind of logical inference. They're just kind of there.
That's really interesting. So it's not like you're building a case for God's existence based on other things you know. It's more like you have a direct kind of intuitive grasp of it.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
He proposes that we have this special cognitive faculty, the sensus divinitatis. He borrows the term from John Calvin, which is like specifically designed to produce true beliefs about God. And when this faculty is working correctly, in the right circumstances, it gives you what he calls warrant.
Warrant. That sounds, I don't know, almost legal.
Well, in philosophy, it's the thing that separates just having a true belief from actually having knowledge. Like, if
Yeah.
you win the lottery just by randomly guessing the numbers, you have a true belief about the winning numbers, but you don't really have knowledge, right? You just got lucky. But if you knew the numbers in advance because, I don't know, you rigged the system or something, then you have warrant for your belief. You're justified in believing it because you have good reasons.
Okay, so warrant is about having good reasons for your belief. And in Plantinga's view, this sensus divinitatis, this God-sensing faculty, is like our built-in way of having good reasons to believe in God.
Exactly. And it even extends this idea to specifically Christian beliefs, suggesting that the Holy Spirit kind of plays a similar role in making the truths of the gospel directly known to believers.
It's fascinating that the Stanford entry also points out this similar idea from like way back in history with Al-Ghazali.
It is. Al-Ghazali, in his book Deliverance from Error, he talks about this higher cognitive faculty, a kind of spiritual intuition that helped him overcome his own, like, really profound skeptical doubts. So this idea that humans might have this special divinely given capacity for religious knowledge, it's not just a modern idea. It's been around for centuries in different philosophical and theological traditions.
Right. Okay, so even in this model of faith as knowledge, there's still an effective component, isn't there? It's not just about cold, hard facts.
Yeah, you're right. Even Calvin, when he defined faith, he didn't just say it was something revealed to our minds, but also something that was sealed upon our hearts. So there's this element of acceptance, of embracing this knowledge as true and meaningful, not just intellectually grasping it.
That makes sense. It's like it has to resonate with you on a deeper level.
Okay, so if faith is knowledge on this model,
Mhm.
what about the whole practical side of things? Like, how does knowing something about God translate into, well, actually doing things in the world? Well, in this model, actions are seen more as a result of faith, a way of expressing or acting out the divinely revealed knowledge. So like trusting God, obeying his commands, those are things you do because of your knowledge of God, but they're not necessarily considered part of faith itself. Faith is primarily about the knowledge, the receiving and accepting of it.
Okay, I see. It's like the foundation upon which you then build your actions. But speaking of foundations, this whole idea of faith as knowledge, it kind of bumps up against this big question of faith and reason, doesn't it?
Mhm.
There often feels like there's this inherent tension there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that tension is one of the central themes in pretty much all philosophical discussions of faith. You have that famous line from Kant where he says, I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. He's basically saying that faith operates in this realm beyond what we can strictly prove or know through like our normal ways of thinking.
Right, like that whole idea of a leap of faith. And then you have that other side, like with David Hume and W.K. Clifford, those guys who are all about evidence, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, the evidentialists. Hume basically said that a wise person always proportions their belief to the evidence. And Clifford, he took it even further, saying that it's actually morally wrong to believe something without sufficient evidence. So for those guys, faith, especially religious faith, well, it's pretty problematic.
It seems like it, yeah. Because if you're placing your faith on things that can't be empirically proven, then according to the evidentialists, you're not really being rational or maybe even ethical.
Right. And that's the big challenge, right? Like, is it okay to have these beliefs, especially these big, important religious beliefs, without having, like, rock solid proof?
So how does Reformed epistemology, that whole Plantinga thing we talked about, how does that try to address this very serious evidentialist challenge?
Well, it does it by saying that those basic theistic beliefs, the ones that come from the sensus divinitatis, they're justified without having to be inferred from other evidence. Plantinga argues that they meet a fundamental evidential requirement because they're directly evident in the believer's experience.
Yeah.
But he's careful to distinguish this view from, like, full-blown fideism.
Fideism, that sounds intense.
It is. Fideism basically says, screw reason, faith is all you need.
Hmm.
But Reformed epistemology is trying to strike a balance, saying, look, there are good reasons for these beliefs, but they're not the kind of reasons that you can, like, write down in a logical proof.
Okay, interesting. So it's like the experience itself is the evidence. But even if we accept that, the Stanford entry brings up this really important point about entitlement.
Ah, yes, entitlement.
Right. It's like even if these theistic beliefs are basic and they do have what Plantinga called warrant in this kind of external sense, meaning they're produced by a reliable cognitive faculty, are you really entitled to hold those beliefs? Like, do you have the right to be that confident?
That's a huge question, especially for people who are, thoughtful about their faith, who are aware that there are all these different religious traditions out there.
Mhm.
And they might worry about being wrong, or even worse, being wrong in a way that's harmful. So they want to be sure that they're putting their faith in the right place, so to speak. And that might require more than just having a sense of certainty. It might require having reasons that you can actually articulate and defend.
Right. It can't just be a blind feeling. There needs to be some kind of intellectual justification.
Exactly. And the argument is that Reformed epistemology, while it's a good starting point, it might not fully answer this question of entitlement. Because even if you have this direct experience of God, there could be other explanations for that experience, right? Maybe it's just a psychological phenomenon, or maybe it's coming from a different divine source than you think it is. So even if a God does exist, you still might not be justified in believing that you have this special knowledge of him.
It's like, okay, maybe there's a signal, but how do you know you're tuned to the right frequency?
Exactly. It's a really complex issue.
So if faith isn't necessarily a kind of knowledge, then what about the more common understanding of faith as belief? Because that seems to be how a lot of people talk about it, you know?
Right. This is another big model of faith where it's all about holding specific beliefs that have theological content. So believing that God exists, that God is good, that Jesus was the Son of God, and so on. Richard Swinburne calls this the Thomist view, although Thomas Aquinas' own view is actually a little more nuanced than that, as we'll see later.
Right.
But in this basic model, the rationality of faith is directly tied to the rationality of those beliefs.
Meaning that you should have good reasons to believe those things, right?
Exactly. And philosophers like John Locke and actually Swinburne himself, they've tried to provide those good reasons. Locke wrote this book called The Reasonableness of Christianity, where he basically tries to show that belief in God is, well, reasonable. And Swinburne, he's more contemporary, but he uses this like Bayesian approach to argue for the rationality of theistic belief.
Bayesian, like with statistics.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. But basically, he tries to show that given all the evidence we have about the world, it's actually more probable than not that God exists.
Okay, interesting. But then there's this whole idea of evidential ambiguity that the Stanford entry talks about. What's that all about?
Ah, yes. Evidential ambiguity. This is where things get even trickier. Basically, this thesis, and it's been championed by a bunch of philosophers like John Hick and Stephen Davis, it argues that all the evidence we have about God, well, it could be interpreted in multiple ways. So you could look at the world and say, yeah, this points to a creator, or you could look at the same world and say, nope, this is all just the result of random chance.
So the evidence isn't conclusive either way.
Right. And they point to things like the diversity of religious beliefs throughout history, the fact that even really smart people disagree about God, and they argue that this kind of suggests that the evidence is inherently ambiguous.
Yeah.
Some even go further and say that the very arguments for and against God, they end up being circular, like they depend on assumptions you already have about the world.
So, if you already believe in God, you'll see the evidence as supporting that belief. And if you don't, well, you'll interpret the evidence in a way that supports your non-belief.
Pretty much, yeah. And that poses a real challenge for this model of faith as belief. Because if the evidence is fundamentally ambiguous, then can you really say that believing in God is rational?
It seems like a tough sell, yeah. But this model of faith as belief, it really emphasizes the content of those beliefs, right? Like what you specifically believe about God is what makes it religious faith.
Yes, definitely. So it's not just about having strong beliefs. It's about having strong beliefs about the right things, about God, or about specific religious doctrines. And this, like the faith as knowledge model, tends to view faith as something pretty unique to religion. It's not just any kind of strong belief. It has to be a belief about the divine.
Okay, so the content is key. Now, you mentioned earlier that Aquinas, the Thomas guy, his view of faith is a bit more nuanced than simply equating it with belief. So what was his take?
Yeah, Aquinas is interesting. He saw faith as kind of occupying this middle ground between knowledge and opinion. So, like knowledge, faith involves conviction, but it's not based on, like, direct perception or proof. And he emphasized this idea of inner assent to religious truths, and assent that's driven by the will and grounded in divine revelation.
So it's not just about passively accepting some information. There's an active component to it, a choice involved.
Exactly. And this can be a little tricky for modern philosophers because a lot of them think of belief as something that just happens to you, not something you actively choose. But Aquinas might argue that, well, you can't just force yourself to believe something, but you can kind of steer yourself in a certain direction. Like you can choose to expose yourself to religious teachings, you can pray, you can engage in practices that might cultivate faith.
It's like creating the conditions for faith to flourish.
Exactly. And for Aquinas, the key is that we assent to these religious truths because they're revealed by God, and we trust in the authority of that revelation.
Which brings us back to that whole question of circularity, doesn't it? Because if you're believing in God based on the authority of revelation, but your belief in the authority of revelation depends on your belief in God, well, it's a chicken and egg situation.
It is, and Descartes was very critical of this kind of circular reasoning. He was all about finding a firm foundation for knowledge, and he argued that you can't just assume the truth of something in order to prove the truth of something else that depends on it.
Right. It's like using a dictionary to define a word and then looking up the definition of that word, and it just sends you back to the original word. You're not really getting anywhere.
Yeah, exactly. So even though both Aquinas and the Reformed tradition, they emphasize this idea of accepting divine revelation, the question of whether you're actually justified in doing so, that remains a big philosophical challenge.
Okay, so we've talked about faith as knowledge, faith as belief, and all the philosophical baggage that comes with those. But now let's shift gears a bit and talk about faith as trust, which, makes sense intuitively, right? We often use those words interchangeably in everyday language.
Right, and this is where we get into the fiducial model of faith. And the emphasis here is on believing in something, rather than just believing that something is true. Like, believing in a friend is different from just believing that they exist.
Yeah, totally. It's about having a relationship, about relying on them, about trusting them.
Exactly, and that's the core of this model.
Yeah.
It's about trusting God, relying on Him, making a commitment to Him. And this trust, it involves a certain degree of risk, right? Like, you're putting yourself out there, you're making yourself vulnerable.
And that's where the whole blind faith thing comes in, right?
Yeah.
Like, is it rational to trust someone or something without having any evidence that they're trustworthy?
That's the big question, yeah. And there's a lot of debate about what constitutes reasonable trust versus, like, reckless trust. But one idea is that even when we don't have complete evidence, we often trust based on, like, a broader assessment of the situation.
So it's not just about the evidence itself, it's about the context, the potential outcomes, the stakes involved.
Exactly. Like, think about a doctor. You might not understand all the medical jargon they're using, but you trust their expertise because you know they've studied for years and they have your best interests at heart. Or think about, like, a close friend. You might not have concrete proof that they'll always be there for you,
Yeah.
but you trust them based on your shared history, your understanding of their character.
Right, you trust them because you know them.
Exactly. And some philosophers argue that something similar might be going on with religious faith. Like, you might not have irrefutable proof of God's existence, but you trust him based on, I don't know, your religious experiences, your understanding of his nature as revealed in Scripture, your sense of his presence in your life.
So it's about building a relationship with God, even if that relationship isn't based on the kind of evidence that you would use in, say, a scientific experiment.
Right. And that's where this distinction between the doxastic and fiducial aspects of faith comes in.
Doxastic and fiducial, those are some fancy words.
I know, right? But they're actually pretty helpful. So the doxastic aspect is about your beliefs about God. Like, do you believe he exists? Do you believe he's good? And those beliefs, they can be stronger or weaker depending on the evidence you have. But the fiducial aspect, that's about the act of trust itself. It's about actually relying on God, regardless of how certain you are about those doxastic beliefs.
So you might have some doubts, you might not be 100% sure about everything, but you still choose to trust.
Exactly. And that's what makes this model so interesting, because it allows for faith even in the face of uncertainty.
And that brings us to this idea of faith as doxastic venture, which kind of builds on this whole trust thing, right?
It does. But it adds another layer of complexity. See, the doxastic venture model recognizes that trusting God might be a little different from trusting a person. Because if God really is all-powerful and all-knowing, then there's no real risk of him letting you down, right?
I guess so, yeah. If he's perfect, then he's not going to screw up.
Right. But the challenge, especially for people who see theism as evidentially ambiguous, is believing that such a God actually exists in the first place. So, trusting God might involve a doxastic venture, which means going beyond the evidence and choosing to believe that God exists and is worthy of your trust.
So it's not just venturing in your actions based on your beliefs, it's venturing in the belief itself.
Exactly. And this model tackles that head on. It's like saying, okay, I might not have all the proof I need, but I'm going to choose to believe anyway.
It's a bold move, and this is where we get into that whole theological non-realism thing, right?
Yeah, that's one way to try and deal with this evidential pressure. The non-realists, they basically say that religious claims, they're not meant to be taken literally. They're more like metaphors or stories that help us live a good life.
So it's not about whether God actually exists, it's about the value of believing in God.
Right. But a lot of people, especially those who are committed to traditional religious views, they reject this non-realist approach. They say, no, faith is about grasping reality. It's about connecting with something that's truly there.
Right, it's not just a feel-good story, it's about truth. And speaking of truth, the Stanford entry talks about some differences between doxastic venture and regular old interpersonal trust. What are some of those key differences?
Well, one big difference is that in our relationships with people, we get constant feedback, right? Like,
Wow.
if you trust a friend and they betray you, well, that's evidence that maybe they weren't as trustworthy as you thought. But with God, especially if you accept that the evidence is ambiguous, you might not get that kind of clear confirmation or disconfirmation.
So it's a bigger leap of faith in a way.
It can be. Yeah, you're making a commitment without necessarily having the same kind of reassurance that you would get in a human relationship.
And there's also the issue of belief being voluntary, right? Like, can you really choose to believe something?
That's a big philosophical debate. But the doxastic venture model, it doesn't say that you can just flip a switch and decide to believe anything you want. It's more about taking a belief that you already have, maybe it's something you were raised with, or maybe it's something you've come to through personal experience, and choosing to act on it, to live as if it were true, even if you have some lingering doubts.
So it's about commitment, about putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak.
Exactly. And that brings us to William James and his famous argument about the will to believe.
Ah, yes, James. Always a good time.
Right. So James basically argued that in certain situations where the evidence is inconclusive and the choice is really important, it's actually okay to let your passional nature guide you. Like, if believing in God will make you a better person and there's no clear evidence against it, then go for it.
It's like saying, look, I know I don't have all the answers, but I'm going to choose to believe because it's good for me and it's not hurting anyone.
Yeah, and that's a pretty controversial position.
Yeah.
But it does resonate with this whole idea of doxastic venture. You're taking a risk, you're making a leap, but you're doing it for good reasons.
And this model, it also offers a way to reconcile the idea of faith as a gift from God with this more active, volitional aspect of faith.
It does. Like maybe the gift is the initial inclination to believe, the seed of faith, but it's up to you to cultivate that seed, to choose to water it and let it grow.
So it's a collaboration between you and the divine.
Exactly. And this model, it actually resonates with a lot of different thinkers. Kierkegaard, for example,
Yeah.
he famously defined faith as an objective uncertainty, held fast in an appropriation process of the most passionate inwardness.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
I know, right? But basically, he's saying that faith involves embracing uncertainty, holding on to your belief, even when you don't have all the answers. And he also talks about this leap, this decision to commit yourself to something that you can't fully grasp rationally.
Right, it's like you're jumping into the abyss, but you're trusting that there's something there to catch you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have Paul Tillich, who talked about faith as the state of being ultimately concerned. So whatever you're ultimately concerned with, whatever gives your life meaning and purpose, that's your faith. And that concern, it might not be something that you can prove or disprove scientifically. It's more about a fundamental orientation, a way of being in the world.
And even Aquinas, despite his emphasis on revelation, he could be interpreted through this lens of doxastic venture.
Yeah, because for Aquinas, reason alone can't get you to those foundational truths of faith. You need revelation. You need grace. But you also need to choose to accept that grace, to open yourself to it.
So there's this interplay between the divine and the human. Okay, so we've talked about all these different thinkers, but what about the actual content of faith? Like, what are those beliefs that people are venturing to believe in?
Well, in the doxastic venture model, those beliefs are often seen as what are called highest order framing principles. It's like they're not just random beliefs. They're the fundamental assumptions that shape how you see the world.
So it's not just believing in God, it's believing in a whole worldview that's centered on God.
Exactly. And because those beliefs are so foundational, you can't really evaluate them based on evidence within that worldview. It's like they're the rules of the game, so you can't use the rules of the game to judge whether the rules of the game are valid.
It's like trying to use a ruler to measure itself. It doesn't really work.
Right. So accepting those beliefs, it's a huge step. It's like choosing to see the world through a particular lens, even if you don't have absolute proof that that lens is the right one.
And that's where the whole question of justification comes in again, right? Like, when is it okay to make that leap, to venture beyond the evidence?
That's the million-dollar question, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of debate about that. Some philosophers, they say that it's never okay to believe something without sufficient evidence. Others, they say that sometimes when the stakes are really high and the evidence is inconclusive, it might be permissible or even rational to make a leap of faith.
It's like sometimes you just have to go with your gut, even if you can't fully explain why.
Yeah, and that's a scary thought for some people, but it's also kind of exciting, right? Like it opens up the possibility for faith, even in a world where we don't have all the answers.
It does. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, I want to touch on this idea of venturing faith without belief, which sounds like, well, a contradiction in terms.
It does sound a bit paradoxical, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually a really interesting idea. So in this model, faith is about making a practical commitment, a commitment to living as if certain things were true, even if you don't fully believe them.
So it's like, you're not sure if God exists, but you're going to act as if he does anyway.
Yeah, kind of. It's about adopting a certain way of life, of orienting yourself towards something that you value, even if you have doubts.
And the motivation for that commitment, it comes from this idea that those things would be good if they were true, right? Like a world with God would be a better world than a world without God, even if you're not sure which world you're actually living in.
Exactly. And this commitment, it doesn't have to be based on blind faith. It could be based on like a careful consideration of the possibilities, a weighing of the potential benefits and risks.
So it's not just about wishful thinking, it's about making a calculated gamble.
Right. And this model, it actually has some support from pretty big names in philosophy. William Tennant, for example, he argued that faith can be about acting in accordance with certain ideals, even if you don't have conclusive proof that those ideals are objectively true. And Richard Swinburne, he even proposed a pragmatist model of faith, where you choose to believe in God because it's the best bet, so to speak.
So it's like Pascal's wager, but without the whole eternal damnation thing.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that a lot of contemporary philosophers, they're starting to coalesce around this idea that faith is fundamentally about commitment, regardless of whether you have full-blown belief.
So it's not about what you think, it's about what you do.
Yeah, in a way. It's about how you live your life, what you choose to prioritize, how you choose to relate to the world. And that commitment, it can be just as strong, even stronger, than a belief that's based solely on intellectual assent.
Because actions speak louder than words. Right.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about all these different models of faith. But what about the relationship between faith and hope? They seem to go hand in hand a lot of the time.
Yeah, they do. Like, you hope that the things you have faith in are true.
Right. And some philosophers have even suggested that maybe the best way to understand religious commitment is through the lens of hope. Because hope, it doesn't require the same level of certainty as belief.
So hope is more about possibility, about keeping an open mind, about wanting something to be true even if you're not sure if it is.